Elias had always been the kind of man who passed by silently in a room. People hardly noticed when he arrived or when he left. He worked in a small local factory that printed labels for food companies. Every day looked exactly like the previous one, machines humming, labels stacking, workers complaining about wages, and supervisors timing bathroom breaks. But Elias didn't complain. He carried a kind of calm with him, as if he had learned long ago that noise never solved anything. At work, no one knew who he really was beyond a quiet worker. He didn't join group conversations, didn't sit with others during lunch breaks unless someone invited him, and he never shared anything personal about his life. But what nobody knew was that after work, when others went out drinking, scrolling their phones, or chatting endlessly online, Elias had a place of his own. He went to a small community hall 2 streets from his apartment. It wasn't glamorous. The lights flickered, the chairs looked older than time, and sometimes the ceiling leaked when it rained. But inside that hall sat a second-hand upright piano, polished only halfway, missing a tiny piece of wood at the corner, and always slightly out of tune. To anyone else, it was just an old instrument, something that should have been replaced a decade ago. But to Elias, it was his doorway into a world that made sense. He had learned piano when he was younger, not through teachers or expensive classes, but through a small keyboard his father bought from a garage sale. His father, now long gone, had always said something Elias kept close to his heart. Music doesn't need education, it needs honesty. Every time Elias touched any instrument, that sentence returned to him. He used to sit by his window at night, playing softly because the keys made noise, and they lived in a thin-walled apartment building. Neighbors didn't always love it, but no one ever complained too strongly. Many times he played songs his father used to hum. Sometimes he simply played what came to his heart, creating new pieces without writing anything down. People at work had no idea. They only knew that someone once overheard him humming a tune and asked whether he knew music. Elias had quietly nodded, and from that moment, the rumor began. Some workers turned it into a joke. "Oh yeah, he says he can play the piano like professionals." Others exaggerated. "He probably performs on weekends somewhere fancy." A few simply dismissed him as strange, but Elias never corrected any of them. He never tried to explain, defend, or push himself into conversations. He kept working, kept clocking in early, and kept leaving silently. One coworker once told another, "He thinks he's too good to talk to us." But that wasn't true. Elias didn't think anything of himself. He just believed speaking unnecessarily only created confusion. He had learned that silence preserved peace. Still, misunderstandings grew, and misunderstandings, when repeated enough, turned into judgments. At night after work, he walked back into that hall, unlocking the side door with an old key. The hall caretaker trusted him. "Just close the lights when you're done," the caretaker always reminded. Elias sat at the piano and played. His body relaxed in a way no other time brought him. His back softened, his shoulders loosened, his face changed. He didn't look tired. He looked like someone alive again. The music wrapped around the empty room. He wasn't playing for applause. He wasn't playing to impress anyone. He was simply speaking in the only language he deeply understood. A few local people knew of him, not close friends, just regular visitors. They sometimes stopped by quietly to listen. Some evenings, a mother would sit with her young daughter while Elias played lullabies. At times, a retired man would close his eyes and sit through the entire practice session. No one spoke much. They would only say thank you before leaving. But at work, none of that existed. There, he was simply the quiet man, nothing more. One Tuesday morning, something changed. A new meeting was announced, a corporate gathering scheduled at the biggest office of their company. Executives were attending, including the CEO, who rarely visited. People were excited because events like that usually came with food, music, speeches, and bonuses. During break time, while workers sat at tables eating, someone mentioned that the event needed entertainment. A few laughed, and someone said loudly, "You know what? Elias can play. He always says he knows piano." The comment wasn't said kindly. Everyone knew that. Another worker responded, "Yeah, maybe he can perform in front of the CEO. Imagine if he freezes." The table erupted in small laughter. Elias didn't respond. He didn't even look toward them. But they saw something in his face, a slight stillness, as if he wasn't sure whether it was a joke or a request. One coworker, one of the louder ones, placed his hand on Elias's shoulder half mockingly. "Come on, you'll play at the event, right? We'll make sure they let you. It's time to show your talent." Elias felt uncomfortable. He wanted to say no. He wanted to say playing for a room of executives wasn't something he needed or wanted. But something inside him reminded him of his father, how he once told Elias never to hide what was given to him. So instead of refusing, he simply nodded. That nod spread across the entire workplace. Did you hear? He agreed. Oh my, this is going to be interesting. He better not embarrass himself. Some workers didn't care. Many others were secretly hoping he made a fool of himself. But none of that mattered to Elias that night. He walked back to the hall and played. This time, his music was slower, deeper. Even the caretaker paused near the door listening. You're playing differently, he said. Elias didn't explain why. Inside him was something mixed: fear, anticipation, doubt, and a tiny spark of courage. He wasn't performing for strangers. He wasn't trying to prove anything. Still, it was different from playing in an empty hall. People now expected something from him. He closed his eyes and kept playing, imagining that when the day came, he would play something honest, not loud, not flashy, just truthful. Something that represented where he came from, who he was, and what his father left behind. And little did he know, the invitation that was given not out of respect, but mockery, would eventually open a door larger than he ever dreamed. For now, he remained unaware. He only played, letting the sound fill the room, unaware that his quietness, his patience, and his gift would soon be witnessed by people who had no idea what silence could hold. The day of the gathering was still a week away, yet it felt closer every time someone mentioned it at work. What began as a passing comment soon turned into daily reminders. Some co-workers asked him if he was practicing. Others said things half-jokingly like, "Hope you're ready for a big audience," and some simply waited for his reaction. Elias never reacted. He only nodded quietly and continued his tasks. But inside, he was not untouched by it. He felt something moving in his chest whenever anyone brought up the event. Not excitement, just pressure. He didn't want to perform for people who weren't genuinely interested. It wasn't stage fright. It was the feeling of doing something meaningful in front of people who expected entertainment, rather than honesty. That night, as he walked again to the community hall, he placed his hand on the doorknob and paused. He wondered if performing for strangers would change how he saw his music. Would it become something like a performance instead of what it always had been, a quiet space where feelings breathed freely? He stepped inside, locked the door, and sat at the piano. He didn't play right away. He just rested his hands on his knees and looked at the keys. He remembered how his father used to sit beside him during practice. He remembered how his father would tap lightly on the edge of the keyboard whenever Elias made a mistake, not to scold him, but to guide him. Those memories never faded, and when he finally began to play, the room filled instantly. He wasn't playing for anyone there because no one was there. He was playing for his father. He was playing for the space that always allowed him to be himself. At the factory the next day, more conversations floated around him. The event was getting bigger than anyone expected. Word spread that senior leaders were flying in, department heads were preparing speeches, and people from other branches of the company were being invited. It wasn't just a small gathering anymore, it was something important. During lunch break, someone brought up the topic again. "So, Elias," one worker said, leaning back in his chair, "do you know what you're going to play?" Elias lifted his head gently, unsure how to respond. "I'll play something," he answered simply. The table erupted in laughter, though not all of it was harmful. Some found it amusing in a friendly way, others in a mocking way. One co-worker replied, "That's not how performances work. You need something prepared." Another added, "Hope you don't freeze." Someone else whispered loudly enough for people to hear, "He'll probably press 3 keys and walk away." Elias didn't respond, but he felt the heaviness more than before. Later that day, 3 people walked over to him near the storage area, where he was labeling boxes. They invited him again, though this time with fake encouragement. "You're going to be the highlight of the event," one of them said. "You'll play in front of the CEO." Another added. The third person leaned forward slightly and said, "Don't worry, we'll be recording. If you mess up, at least you'll be memorable." They laughed and walked away. Elias simply continued placing labels on boxes, but something inside him had shifted. Not because of their words, but because he realized he would not be performing for them. They weren't his audience. The moment he sat down at that piano, the noise around him would no longer matter. He wasn't a performer trying to win approval. He was someone expressing what he once learned alone. That night, he went again to the hall. This time, the place wasn't empty. 2 children were playing inside, chasing each other between rows of chairs while their grandmother watched. "You can play," The older woman told him. "We don't mind listening." Elias nodded and sat down. He played softly, choosing calm melodies so the children wouldn't be frightened by loud notes. As he played, their running slowed. They began sitting on the floor, looking up at him as if trying to understand why someone would play music. That made them feel something unfamiliar. When he finished, the grandmother thanked him. "You play like someone who carries something here," she said, placing her hand over her heart. Elias just nodded kindly and said, "Thank you." He walked back home, and though nothing special happened, his heart felt steadier. The day before the gathering, people at work were buzzing with excitement. Office staff were printing name tags, workers were talking about food arrangements, and supervisors were reminding employees to arrive on time. Someone even approached Elias again. "Just remember, this is a performance," they said, smiling as though the words held weight. But Elias didn't see it that way. When the evening came, he went to the hall one last time before the event. The caretaker stood near the door and said, "You're playing somewhere tomorrow, right?" "Yes," Elias answered gently. "Good," the caretaker replied. "Play something real. Don't try to impress anyone. People don't remember perfection. They remember something that touches them." The caretaker left, and Elias began to play. The music was heavier than usual, not because he tried to make it dramatic, but because he poured into it everything left unspoken. His fear of being judged, his longing for his father, his sense of unfamiliar responsibility. The room absorbed it all. The caretaker eventually returned only to close the main entrance, but stood quietly listening from the doorway. "You'll be fine," he said softly, and then he left again. The next morning arrived quietly. Elias woke up earlier than usual. He didn't rush. He didn't rehearse. He simply got ready, wore a clean shirt, not formal, but simple, and walked to work. The company arranged transportation to the main office building, where the event was being held. Everyone loaded into 2 large buses, laughing, cheering, and speculating about the evening. Elias sat alone near a window. The road outside passed gently. Buildings, trees, and street signs drifted by like moving memories. Someone sitting 2 seats behind him said loudly, "Make sure you don't embarrass us, okay?" Another voice jokingly added, "If everything goes wrong, just pretend you fainted." He didn't turn around. He just breathed slowly. The bus arrived. The building was tall, bright, and filled with decorations. Staff members directed people inside. Music already played faintly in the lobby. People took pictures, fixed their clothes, laughed loudly. Guests from different branches stood. Everywhere, someone pointed toward the stage area. "That's where he's going to perform," they whispered. Elias looked at the piano sitting in the center of the room. It was beautiful, a grand piano, polished perfectly, shining under soft lights. It didn't look anything like the one he played every day. It felt distant, expensive, and unfamiliar. But music wasn't about instruments. His father always said that, and Elias believed it. So he walked closer, not touching it, only observing. Someone behind him said, "When the CEO arrives, they'll call for you." He nodded. People gathered around tables, waiting for speeches. Meanwhile, some co-workers continued, whispering, "We can't wait, we'll film everything." This event just got more interesting. What they didn't know was that the moment they had been waiting for would not go the way they expected. For now, Elias sat quietly, far from the center of attention. He waited, he breathed. He imagined the sound of the keys, not loud, not impressive, just honest. And soon, the moment would arrive when everyone in that hall would watch him step forward, not as someone being mocked, but as someone carrying something bigger than their opinions. When the event finally began, it didn't feel like a simple gathering. The place was filled with lights, people dressed in their best clothes, and quiet conversations floating from one side of the room to the other. Every table had bright decorations, and the kind of music that plays from speakers just to fill silence. Elias walked in slowly and found a place near the wall, away from the excitement. People moved from table to table, greeting supervisors, laughing, taking photos by the decorative signs at the entrance. Some walked near Elias but didn't greet him, as if he was simply part of the room. Over the speakers, someone announced that food would be served soon and that several activities were planned. One co-worker walked close and said, "You scared?" then walked away before Elias answered. The piano was placed on a small stage area facing the audience. It looked untouched, shining as though it had been polished an hour before. A soft light fell over it, making the keys glow. Soon, one of the company coordinators called for everyone's attention. He welcomed staff from different branches and thanked everyone for coming. His tone was cheerful and confident. The room listened, clapping at the polite moments. Then a hired pianist arrived and began performing. The melodies were smooth, practiced, almost mechanical in their perfection. People clapped politely after each piece. The workers from Elias's branch watched closely. "That's who he'll perform after," one whispered. "Let's see how he compares," another said. They waited like people waiting for entertainment, not like people witnessing someone's personal truth. The coordinator walked back onto the stage. "Next," he said, smiling widely, "someone from our own staff will perform. He comes from our factory division." A few workers clapped loudly and shouted as if this was the moment they had been building up. "Please welcome Elias," the coordinator announced. Elias stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't look around. He walked quietly toward the piano while whispers moved quickly through the tables. "Is he really going to play? Watch this. This is going to be good." He reached the piano but didn't sit immediately. He touched the corner of the instrument gently, as though acknowledging it. Then an unexpected moment happened. Someone from the group who invited him pressed something near the floor behind the stage, where a panel of chords and switches was placed. No one else noticed when Elias sat at the piano and pressed his hands gently on the keys. The room waited. He began playing, except no sound came out. The first row started laughing immediately. "He doesn't even know how to turn it on. He said he could play." Some clapped mockingly. Elias pressed another key, and another, and then tried the lower octaves. Nothing. No sound. The room started to fall into the kind of silence that isn't quiet, it's loud, uncomfortable, and full of judgment. The hired pianist stood watching from the side, unsure whether to jump in. Someone from the back called out, "Play louder," and laughter followed. Elias didn't look toward anyone. He simply lifted his hands from the keys and sat still. He knew exactly what happened. The piano had been unplugged. He had noticed the power switch when he first walked in, but assumed the technicians had prepared everything correctly. He didn't stand, didn't defend himself, didn't point fingers. He just waited. The coordinator walked back in confusion. "One moment," he said, repeatedly. He bent down behind the piano and saw the unplugged cord. His eyebrows tightened. The hired pianist walked over and plugged it in. Someone whispered, "Maybe he unplugged it himself because he got scared." Another whispered, "This is embarrassing." Still, Elias sat silently. The coordinator stepped aside, and people waited. Some were entertained by the failure already. Some didn't yet know what was coming. He lifted his hands again, but before he could play, someone stepped forward near the stage. She wasn't on the program schedule, and people immediately recognized her. It was the CEO. She had arrived quietly minutes earlier, and many people hadn't noticed. She spoke calmly, her voice carrying through the microphone the coordinator had left on. "I want him to play again," she said. The room froze. "And I want everyone to listen," she continued. She didn't raise her voice, but the tone carried something firm. She turned toward the coordinator and asked, "Was the piano unplugged on purpose?" He didn't answer, only shrugged and looked away. Elias lowered his eyes, but the CEO walked a step closer. "Play what you came to. Play," she said. She stepped back. No laughter now. No whispers. No phones recording yet. Just silence. Elias placed his fingers on the keys and began. He didn't start with something dramatic. He didn't start with something flashy. He played the first melody he ever learned, a slow, thoughtful piece his father used to hum. The room changed. The sound was soft, not loud enough to fill the space at first, but intimate enough that people leaned in. His hands went from steady to sure, and the melody grew fuller. There was no sheet music. There was no guiding beat. Just emotion. The hired pianist stepped closer unconsciously, his curiosity pushing him forward. People began lowering their phones and focusing on the actual sound, not on entertainment. Then Elias moved into something new, something of his own. Notes flowed that no one recognized, but they carried something rare. It was a sound that didn't come from practice. It came from memory. He pressed each key gently, but firmly enough that every note held meaning. People who had laughed now stared. One woman wiped her eyes. Even the workers who invited him stood still. They had expected nervous shaking hands, maybe random noise. What they got instead was raw truth. Music that made people feel something. Someone whispered, "Where has this been all this time?" When Elias finished, he didn't bow. He didn't look around. He lifted his hands, rested them on his lap, and exhaled. The room did nothing for 3 seconds, 3 long seconds. Then applause came, not loud at first, but steady. People stood. Not all of them, but enough for others to follow. The CEO walked closer. Again, that was beautiful, she said. She leaned slightly toward him and said something softer that the microphone did not catch, but it reached him. He nodded gently. He wasn't smiling, not in excitement, but in quiet relief. The room was still clapping. And the group that invited him for the first time didn't know what to say. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't filming. They were standing among people who were genuinely moved. Elias stood slowly and stepped down from the stage. Everyone watched him walk. Not because they wanted something more, but because they realized they had underestimated someone who carried something rare. No one knew yet how much that moment would mean, not for him, not for the room, not for the ones who tried to mock him. But everything shifted right there, with nothing more than a piano and a truth they didn't expect to witness. After Elias stepped down from the stage, the applause slowly softened, but the effect of what he played remained heavy in the air. People returned to their seats, though many were still looking toward him, as if waiting to see what he would do next. He didn't look for any attention. He just sat on the far side of the room, the same way he did when he first walked in, quiet, steady, separate from the noise. The hired pianist walked toward him and said quietly, "That was not something you learned from lessons." Elias nodded gently. The man placed his hand over his heart and whispered, "It came from here." Then he walked away, leaving Elias alone. Some workers from his branch tried approaching him, but every time they got close, something like guilt stopped them. They knew they didn't invite him to celebrate him. They knew why he was asked to perform. But now, none of them knew how to stand in front of him. The coordinator returned to the microphone and continued the program. But the excitement was different now. Before Elias played, the room was full of laughter, casual talk, and loud anticipation. After his performance, everyone spoke softer, as though the room remembered something meaningful. During dinner, people kept looking at Elias, even those who once mocked him. No one knew how to begin speaking to him. He wasn't sitting proudly, wasn't trying to be seen. He was eating quietly, minding his own space. Then the CEO stood up again, but this time she didn't go to the microphone. She walked directly toward Elias. The entire room watched. She sat next to him, not across, not nearby, but beside him. She spoke softly, yet loud enough that people near them could hear. "I want you to play again before the night ends," she said. Elias looked at her. He didn't know whether she was asking politely or telling him, but he nodded. She leaned slightly closer and said, "Music like that shouldn't be played once." She stood up, rested a hand gently on his shoulder, then returned to her seat. Conversations across the room instantly changed direction. "He's playing again?" she specifically asked him. "That's serious." People who once joked about his talent now leaned forward in curiosity. Even people from other branches, who had not witnessed his daily silence, felt drawn to him. A group sitting nearby began whispering, but it wasn't mocking anymore. They were remembering what they heard. One person said, "That second piece he played, it sounded like someone remembering a place." Another added, "I haven't felt something like that from music in a long time." Meanwhile, some of the people who invited him with wrong intentions sat quietly. The same workers who had laughed earlier now couldn't keep their heads up. Later in the evening, the coordinator announced, "Before we end tonight, we have requested one more performance." People turned again toward Elias. He didn't walk quickly. His movement was calm, almost like someone walking towards something familiar. He sat again. The CEO stood nearby, not speaking this time, just watching, and Elias began playing. But this time, the emotion was different. He played something that sounded like a conversation. Soft notes, moving gently back and forth, like two people speaking without needing words. His right hand carried bright tones, while his left answered with deeper ones. The room remained completely quiet. Even those who didn't understand music understood that something was being told slowly. The piece grew into something clearer, something like a memory walking through years of silence. People closed their eyes just to feel the sound better. It was not loud, not dramatic, not dazzling, but it had truth. Toward the end, he changed rhythm, a soft ending, almost like someone closing a door gently. Then the final note landed. No one moved. No one clapped immediately. For a moment, it was just silence. Then, applause again, but deeper this time. Not excitement. Appreciation. The CEO walked to him and said, "I want you to stay after this." The hired pianist stood beside Elias and said, almost in disbelief, "Where have you been hiding?" Elias stood slowly and stepped away from the stage. After the event, people began leaving. The decorations were being removed. Tables were being cleared. Chairs were being stacked. But the CEO, a few supervisors, and the hired pianist stayed. Behind one of the supervisors called Elias. "Forward, there's someone who wants to speak with you," he said. The CEO spoke first. "I have no idea how your talent has been unknown inside this company," she began. Elias remained quiet. She continued. "People perform beautifully when they are trained, but what you played today was a reflection of someone's life. I could hear grief, hope, and something unresolved." He looked down at his hands, unsure what to say. He wasn't used to people looking at him like this. The CEO then asked a surprising question. "Have you ever recorded what you play?" "No," Elias answered softly. The hired pianist shook his head slowly, almost amazed. The CEO nodded and said, "I want to sponsor your first recording, if you're willing." Elias looked at her, almost as if confirming her sincerity. She nodded once more. "I won't rush you," she said, "but think about it seriously." Then she smiled gently, a kind of smile that didn't come from politeness, but respect. "Before leaving," she said, "someone with your gift should not remain unseen." When she left, the hall was almost empty. The workers who had invited him earlier watched from a distance. They approached slowly, unsure how to speak. One of them finally said, "You played really well." It wasn't confidence, it was shame wearing thin words. Elias didn't reply much, just nodded. "This is big for you," another said. Again. He nodded. They walked away without knowing what else to say. The hired pianist came close. "You don't need lessons," he said softly, "but if you ever want help building arrangements, I would be honored." Elias nodded again, not dismissive, not overly grateful, just calm. He walked outside into the cool night. The street was quiet. The building lights reflected on the ground. He walked back alone while other employees took transportation. On his way home, he passed by the community hall where he played every night. Although it was closed at that hour, he stopped and looked at the dark windows. He remembered every night he sat inside that empty space, playing for no audience. He remembered sitting with an instrument that didn't shine like the one he used tonight. He remembered his father tapping lightly on the keyboard all those years ago. He didn't think about success, fame, or opportunity. He thought about honesty. That night, when he reached home, he placed his hands gently on his table, feeling the quiet around him. His music had been heard not by chance, not by accident, but in the moment it was meant to be. He wondered if he would accept the CEO's offer. He wondered what it would mean to record something that wasn't made for crowds, but for memory. He didn't know yet. He only knew one thing: something had awakened, and whatever came next was no longer in the control of those who tried to embarrass him. It belonged to the music, something he carried all this time without asking anyone to notice. It was a morning that felt different from all the others. The wind outside was calm, and the light from the window rested gently across the room. He sat quietly, thinking about everything that had happened the night before. His phone was filled with messages from people he never expected to hear from. Some were from strangers who wrote long messages saying how his song had moved them. Others were from people he knew from work, but never really spoke to. He read each message slowly because he still could not believe that any of it was real. When he arrived at the company building that morning, something was different. People who used to walk past him without even looking now stopped to greet him. They spoke gently, as though their voices carried respect. Some of them apologized, though he was never angry at them. He only nodded softly and thanked them. He never liked loud reactions or attention, but something inside him was happy. He didn't want revenge, and he didn't enjoy that the tables had turned. He only wanted peace. The CEO called him to her office that same morning. She spoke to him with warmth and sincerity. She told him that his music was not only beautiful, but meaningful. She shared how she felt when she listened to it, how the room had changed last night, how everyone stopped moving and listened like it was the only thing that mattered. Then she told him that she wanted to help him record that song professionally. She said that the company was willing to sponsor everything from the studio time to music distribution and promotions. He sat silently for a moment. He did not know how to react. It felt too big, too unreal. But the CEO smiled and told him to take his time. She said he did not need to decide that day. She only wanted him to know that this opportunity existed because of his own heart, not because of luck and not because of sympathy. He spent the rest of the morning back at his department. He worked quietly, the way he usually did, but everyone was different around him. There was no mockery anymore. There were no whispered insults. Instead, there was curiosity. People wanted to know how long he had been playing. They wanted to know what inspired his music. He answered politely, though only when they genuinely asked. Later that evening, When he reached home, he sat at his keyboard and placed his fingers on the keys. He closed his eyes and played softly. It was not the same melody he played at the company event. It was calmer, brighter, filled with gratitude instead of sadness. His father's photo was still placed on top of the piano, where it always had been. He stared at it gently. He whispered, even though no one else was there, "Thank you." Recording sessions began a few weeks later. At first, he felt shy. The studio was large, filled with equipment he had never used before. The sound engineer spoke kindly and told him to play however he felt, not to think about structure or perfection. So he did. He sat down and played the melody exactly the way it was inside his heart. No corrections, no forced changes, just music that felt true. When he finished playing, there was silence in the room again. People listened without speaking. The engineer simply said, "That was enough. We don't need a second version." And he smiled. The recording was uploaded on music platforms, and the company helped share it online. Slowly, people began listening. At first, it was just a few hundred listeners, then thousands, and soon after, tens of thousands. He never expected this. He never asked for attention. He only wanted music to stay as something personal. But now it was part of other people's lives, too. Every comment he read carried emotion. People wrote about memories they had forgotten until they heard his music. Some said the song reminded them of someone they missed dearly. Others said it helped them calm their minds when they felt overwhelmed. He saved every message, not because he wanted proof of success, but because those messages held real feelings. The CEO invited him again, this time not for a small gathering, but for a larger celebration, where the entire company would be present. She asked him to perform live, and even though the idea made him nervous, he agreed. He wanted to face that room again, but this time with strength instead of uncertainty. The same hall was filled again, but it did not feel like the same place. People looked at him with admiration, not doubt. No one unplugged the piano, no one whispered mocking words. When he sat down and began to play, the room fell silent the way it did the night everything changed. He played a new piece, this time something softer, something hopeful. His music flowed gently, like a path that led from sadness into light. He didn't play to impress anyone. He played because his heart was full. When he finished, the applause was long, but not loud in a harsh way. It was warm, heartfelt, almost quiet in its sincerity. The CEO walked up to him, thanked him publicly, and talked about how talent is often hidden until courage brings it forward. After the performance, some of the same co-workers who once invited him for the wrong reason stood nearby. Their faces carried embarrassment and regret. They said they were sorry not just for that night, but for all the times they ignored him or laughed behind his back. He looked at them and smiled lightly. He said, "It's all right. Those days are behind us." He didn't hold anger. His heart wasn't built that way. Weeks passed, and invitations began arriving from small events, schools, and local centers. He accepted them slowly, one at a time. He still worked at the company because work gave him structure. Music was his gift, not his escape anymore. A local newspaper wrote about him. Later, an online magazine featured his story. People learned how a quiet, unseen man created something beautiful when given a chance. But even then, he never changed his routine at home. He still sat at his keyboard every evening. He still practiced quietly, still played pieces that no one ever heard, still whispered short words of gratitude. He often thought back to that night, the night someone tried to embarrass him. He realized something important. It wasn't the humiliation that mattered. It was what came after. It was the moment when everything turned, not because someone defended him, but because truth revealed itself. Music didn't only change how people saw him, it changed how he saw himself. He learned that even a quiet voice, when expressed honestly, can fill an entire room. He learned that kindness does not make someone weak, it gives strength in places that others can't see. And most importantly, he learned that when something comes from the heart, it eventually reaches other hearts. Life continued, not in a dramatic way, but in a peaceful one. He lived simply, worked normally, and played with sincerity. Each day held meaning, not because the world recognized him, but because he finally recognized himself. And that was enough.